Thank you. This is how to use research to save lives, and I'm Kevin Horeca. So a little bit of background on me. My original background is computer science, and then I switched to neuroscience, did a PhD in that, and now I do data science. But all the while, I've been volunteering at Austin Pets Alive and American Pets Alive since about 2011. I started as a parvo volunteer there, just doing parvo medical treatments. And so for the past, I guess that's what, 8 years or 9 years or something, I've been sort of looking for opportunities to contribute some of the weird background that I have back into sheltering. And after getting a PhD, I realized that a huge area that I can help out with is helping people understand research and use research more to their advantage in making decisions in shelter settings. So I assume if you're here, you probably care something about research. Maybe you want to understand how to use research to improve your practices, processes, and decisions. Maybe you have people who are telling you you need to do that, and you're prepared to be convinced, which hopefully I can do. Or maybe you want to contribute to research one day. So collecting data has been such a big theme of the conference. The next step right after collecting data is using that to actually address specific questions that you have and convincing other people that your particular data says something about the world and about how we should behave. Maybe you just think research is cool, and this was the best talk for that at the moment, or maybe you just need a place to sit and respond to emails. That's also okay. But hopefully it's one of these things. Hopefully you want to actually improve your decision making or even do research one day. So the goal here is going to be to help you feel comfortable using research to make better decisions. So decisions is really the key bit here. Research is just sort of what we're going to be using to improve our decisions. And I'm going to try and help you do this by giving you sort of 10 pieces of what I would consider to be solicited advice, because you're here. So you sort of solicited it from me. And one piece of moral philosophy to kind of contextualize a lot of that advice. The moral philosophy here that I would encourage you to think about as I describe these bits of advice about how to use research is that you should really bias all of these decisions towards trying to do something that improves the situation in your shelter. That probably goes without saying to this group, but it's really easy to lose track of this idea and say, well, we can't do that for this reason, or we can't do that for that reason, and get stuck in the things that you're not willing to try rather than the things that you are willing to try. So keep this idea of, if in doubt, bias towards trying something in mind as I go through some of these bits of advice about research. So number one, and probably the most important one, is think about how you're actually making decisions. I know this probably seems like something that you're doing all the time every day, but taking a moment to actually try to contextualize how you make decisions in a more concrete way can be really helpful. And what I would advocate is what I call the Bayesian belief system. So Bayesian statistics is sort of a branch of statistics, but you can kind of pull out the math and just say, what's the decision-making process that you should use to try to optimally make decisions as you go forward in your day-to-day activities. And what it always comes down to is this idea that you start with some set of beliefs about the world and how the world behaves, and then you try to make the best decision you can using those beliefs. You find out that there's some result to that, and then really the hard step is you have to then update those beliefs according to what you find out about the result. So maybe you try a new program in your shelter and the program works great, so you should update your beliefs to say that that program was a good idea and try to convince other people to do it. Or maybe the program goes terribly and you've spread a disease throughout your shelter by accident or something like that. You should also update your beliefs. So let's go through a couple examples of that because I feel like it's a little abstract. So when you have beliefs, maybe you have a belief about fracture care. Potentially you say, and I know that's a little hard to read, but it says not all fractures need to be surgically repaired. So maybe that's your belief that you come in with. So in order to make the best decision that you can using this belief, you implement a non-surgical fracture care protocol in your shelter. And you examine the results of that program, which could be positive or negative. So when we're making the decision, we don't know what the outcome is going to be. We have some guess based on our beliefs. And if the positive case happens, awesome. We have some cheap, effective fracture care now that we can use to take advantage of and move forward in our shelter and help more animals. Or the negative situation could happen. Now you have a bunch of animals with chronic pain, incontinence, all these other side effects of whatever the treatment is that you had based on your belief. Or more likely, there's something in the middle that happens, some combination of a good case and a bad case across all the different animals that you're working with. And then the hard part, update your beliefs given what happened. So if the good thing happened and all of your animals were doing great and now you have a cheap, effective fracture treatment protocol, then you should believe now that most fractures don't need to be surgically repaired. So notice there's only a minor difference between your original belief and the new one. You've just sort of gotten a little stronger confidence. And so that's when we talk about that, we're thinking about increased certainty. You're more certain about your beliefs. In the middle case, you could say some fractures need to be surgically repaired, so you have a little bit of a decreased certainty in your belief. Or in the extreme case, you could say a lot of fractures need to be surgically repaired. So bad things happened when we tried to do that, and so you might even flip your position. But when you do that, you should have low certainty about that new position because you don't really have a lot of evidence for it. You just accumulated your first bit of evidence on that. Let's do one more example. And sorry, by the way, this is iterative, so it's not a thing that you're just done at the end here. You do it again and again, and you never stop doing it. Another example might be playgroups. So maybe you have a belief that playgroups are good, and so you make a playgroup. And you examine the results, the positive case being that dogs are happy and get adopted faster. Maybe that's the best case scenario. Or maybe you start to spread kennel cough throughout your shelter. So note that your belief at the beginning that playgroups are good was based on the best information you had at the time of making the decisions to start playgroups. And then you find some outcome happens. And so now the critical thing is you have to update those beliefs according to what happened. So maybe everything went well, so you say playgroups are actually great for dogs. I have a much higher certainty that that original belief was true. Or maybe playgroups can be good for dogs, but not always, in which case I've sort of decreased my certainty around the original belief. Or maybe I now say playgroups need to be carefully implemented to avoid disease spread. So here I didn't flip my position, but I sort of added some extra flags to it to say, like, I need to modify my protocols, think about my risk reward a little bit more, and be more careful when implementing this belief. And then, of course, we do this over and over and over again and try to develop better methods. So there's a couple consequences of thinking this way about your decisions. Some are really obvious. Things like your belief should always be subject to change. That sort of falls out naturally from this. One that's maybe not as obvious is the idea that a strongly held belief should be harder to change than a weaker held belief. And this is one that people get trapped in really easily because you might have strong beliefs that really shouldn't be all that strong. And I think we all do. And so those are sort of our biases that we have to be mindful of. And so when something is hard to change, you should ask yourself, do I have a strong belief that is a good belief that I have evidence to support, or is it just strong because I want it to be true? Large changes in the evidence, this is sort of the corollary to the last one, should also result in large changes to your belief. But keep in mind, your beliefs live on a spectrum. And so as we saw in one of the previous examples, if you get a bunch of evidence that a belief you have is wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean you should flip to the exact opposite polar end of the belief spectrum and believe that the opposite is true. It just means that you shouldn't be so certain that that original belief was true. It's a very counterintuitive sort of idea, but we'll come back to it. And then last, and I think this one's the most critical for everyone in this room, and really anyone in sheltering, is that when you make the decision based on your beliefs, you're doing it based on your current evidence. It's unfair to treat yourself based on the evidence you get after trying to implement your belief. Your decision isn't good or bad based on what happens as a consequence of that decision. It's good or bad based on the amount of evidence you had for the decision when you made it. So that's absolutely critical. I've noticed it's a pattern in sheltering that people tend to sort of reevaluate their decisions and say that decision was a bad decision because it had a bad outcome. But if you made that decision with the best information you had available, it was the right decision. And I know that's a little bit counterintuitive, but the thing that's important is to update your beliefs when something bad happens so that when you make the decision again, it's a better decision. So this, I think, actually in many ways sort of takes you off the sort of intellectual and emotional hook for some of those decisions if you're doing a really good job of knowing what beliefs are good beliefs that you have about what you're doing, which is the whole point of research. So now you might be thinking, all right, this is all great, very theoretical, how I should make decisions, but really we're here to talk about sort of getting the opinions of scientists or getting the research from scientists and using the things they've proven to try to enhance those beliefs, right, and to make those beliefs better. So how do scientists do this? How do they prove things? And then how do I take advantage of that? So as a quick aside, the answer to this question is probably not what you're thinking. Does anyone have any guesses as to how scientists prove things? Yeah, so like hypothesis, the scientific method is I think a common opinion here. I'm gonna sort of tell you that I'm trying to trick you. It's a trick question. The answer is that they don't. There is no such thing as proving something. You only gather evidence. So there's no idea in science that something is true or false in an absolute sense. And so when you actually go and investigate sort of philosophy of science, you find that there is no thing called proof. It's simply evidence. And the more evidence there is, the more you should believe it. The less evidence there is, the less you should believe it. So I would encourage you to try to not let yourself believe that things are proven or true or absolute like that. It's just about how much evidence there is. And this shouldn't be something that you let get you down about, like, oh, well, I don't know really that my decisions are great. Because if you think about that decision framework, all you need is to know that there's enough evidence that I should act on it. There's enough evidence that it's worth doing. But scientists do follow a particular procedure. We all know the scientific method: hypothesize, test, analyze, reproduce. If you did elementary level education, you probably learned this. If you went on and did something slightly more advanced, you might have seen like, oh, we're going to define a question, gather information, form an explanatory hypothesis, test the hypothesis, et cetera. And you've got this sort of more detailed version of the scientific method. I'm here to tell you, though, that this is a lie. This is not how science works, and this is not how scientists work. This is how we wish it worked. The real way science works is much more like this. And I'm going to read through this slide for you because there's a lot that goes on here. So scientists start with a belief, just like we all discussed with the belief system. They maybe have a question now based off of that belief. So they have to get some funding, do the project. They change their question because they find there isn't a funding source that actually matches the question they had in the first place. They submit an application for funding, they get rejected. They do that in a loop for about 12 months. Finally, they get some funding, they go do a pilot experiment, the pilot fails, they try something else. They repeat that until the pilot succeeds, they run an experiment, the experiment fails, and then they modify the question of the hypothesis and start over. They do that again for 12 months. They analyze and interpret their findings. Once the experiment finally succeeds, write a paper, the paper gets submitted to a journal, the journal rejects the paper, and then they submit to a less prestigious journal and loop that until they get accepted. They do that for 3 to 12 months. Then finally, their paper gets accepted. You might think, great, this is the end of the story. This is not the end of the story. Now you have to go on to a review process that usually takes about 3 months. That should really be another little loop down there, but I ran out of slide space. And then eventually the paper gets published maybe 6 months later. So the idea, the belief, started way over there 4 years ago. And then 4 years later, there's a paper. How many times did the idea, the question, change throughout this process? Who knows? Like, it changed a bunch of times because of funding, because of the opinions of reviewers, because of the experiment just not working. Maybe that was the idea not working. And this isn't meant to be something that makes you feel bad about science and the scientific process. This is meant to say that when you get to that paper publication step, when a scientist puts out a paper, they've gone through a lot to get that out there, and they probably care a whole lot about that result. And so if you're interested in using that result for something, understand how much the scientist has put in to try to put that out in front of you, and how much they want to help you then contextualize and use it appropriately. There are tons of biases in here, and so this is all the more reason that the advice I'm about to give you about how to use this research should be taken sort of very, very carefully, that you don't want to take any one paper or any one particular situation too seriously, because all of these biases exist in here. And importantly, scientists themselves, researchers, are not unbiased observers of the world. And all of those things I just described are reasons for that, but more than that, the starting step was have beliefs. There was a point at the beginning where the scientists had to decide what question they wanted to ask, and they did the question that they did because they have a particular view of the world, a particular way of thinking. And so the role a scientist takes on is not to be this perfect, unbiased observer, but simply to be aware of their biases. And when you know scientists are doing that, the ones who are really honest and upfront about that with you are going to be a lot easier for you to interact with, because they're not going to try to mislead you about anything that's happening. There are occasionally scientists who don't see themselves this way, and they can be very problematic to work with if you end up interacting with them that way. But this hopefully will help sort of contextualize when you talk to a scientist why they're going to give you kind of loosey-goosey answers, because they're seeing everything through this lens of like, there's so much bias and so much different interpretation that I could do, and so they're really trying not to mislead you, which is why they'll sometimes give you more loose, or will try to give you more sort of loose answers to some of the questions that you ask. And then really, I think the critical thing that you should get out of that is that one piece of paper, one paper that comes out, is just a piece of evidence. There are way too many factors that could contribute to that paper sort of ending up ultimately being good evidence or bad evidence. And if you look up the stats on papers, something like 50%, depending on the field, are often not reproducible. And so you should really look for a bunch of papers that all say the same thing if you really want to care about having strong evidence for the decision. And then critically, and this is the step we all skip, you have to look for papers that contradict the thing that you think is true, because there could be 1,000 of those and only 20 of the thing that you believe in, and then you should not believe that thing because there are 1,000 saying it's wrong. And that's a step that I think we all are inclined to skip, but we really, really, really shouldn't. Okay, so let's jump back into the concrete and use an example. So maybe you're interested in learning more about distemper vaccines. So you do some searching online, you have a question, you say, how long after giving a distemper vaccine is an animal at high risk of catching distemper? This is a pretty practical question that I think that actually there's a talk in this room, not next one, but the one after, that's gonna talk a little bit about this. And so you're interested in finding a paper about this. So let's say we find this paper from looks like 2006 on the distemper vaccine and this question about when is my animal at risk. So we can look through this abstract. If you've never done any searching about papers like this, the abstract is really just a high-level summary, and so we can look at sort of this high-level summary and pull out some key pieces of information. So these are just some slightly modified quotes from the abstract here. So we can find a sentence in here that says dogs were experimentally challenged hours after a single dose of the vaccine and became sick but recovered. Okay, so that's good information to know. Unvaccinated dogs became sick and died. Okay, well, so there was a second group that didn't get the vaccine and it didn't go well for them. Dogs vaccinated with a single dose of the vaccine 1 week before did not get sick. And dogs given one dose of the vaccine hours before exposure did not become sick. So if you read these carefully, you might think, wait, but doesn't the one at the top and the one at the bottom contradict each other? So there's a key sort of difference between the top and the bottom. One was experimentally challenged, the other was exposed. So the bottom one is a real world situation, the top one is an artificial situation that the scientists created. And so you have to be very careful in reading these things to catch those sort of distinctions, but they definitely matter, because the one at the bottom is more the situation you'll actually see in a shelter. The one at the top is just more sort of what the ground truth might be. Okay, so you found this paper, you had this question, you maybe have some reasons you might want to believe this. The results seem very clear, it seems to be coming from a reputable source, it's a good journal, and they have a control group, which is great. If you don't see a control group in a paper, you should be super skeptical. And it's a relatively recent paper. So when we talk about recency being important in papers, all we really mean is that things have changed about how science is done, things have changed about how medicine is done, all of those little details that go into an experiment that you might not get if you're not the scientist who did the experiment, they change and they drift slowly over time. So the more recently some evidence appeared, the stronger you should believe it. It's not to say old evidence is bad. We should totally use old evidence. And if the only paper you can find on a topic is 40 years old, that's still the best evidence you have. You should still use it. But if you find something from 2 years ago, that evidence could be stronger. It's not to say it will be, but it could be. So there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical about this. First and foremost, we just read an abstract. We didn't read the paper. You should never convince yourself something is true from an abstract. That's a great place to start, and it's a great reason to continue to read the paper if it seems like something promising. But it's very easy to trick ourselves into thinking that just because we read it in an abstract that it's true, when that is absolutely not the case. We maybe don't know ourselves personally. I'm not a vet or a medical doctor. I don't know a whole lot about these different abbreviations for the different types of vaccines. I don't know maybe what I use in my shelter, or I don't have the right information to be able to contextualize some of these results, and so I'm not going to believe it as much because I don't understand it as well. And then note throughout all here, sample sizes are never mentioned. We don't know how many animals were used in this paper. They could have used 2 for all we know, in which case we shouldn't believe it at all, or they could have used 10,000, in which case we should believe it a lot. And so that sample size issue we'll come back to in a little bit. And then finally, and this one's a little subtle, when you read an abstract and the effect that they're describing seems super, super clear, you should be skeptical, because most effects in the real world are not clear. And so if something seems black and white when you read it in an abstract, you have every reason to think, oh, there's something funny going on here that I need to figure out and dig into the paper. And we'll talk briefly about how to dig into the paper here in a second. Okay, so what should you do with this information? Well, you can contact the researcher and get a copy of the full paper. This one's behind a paywall, so you may not be able to get it, but researchers can always send you preprints of their paper, and so if you ever find something behind a paywall, email the researcher, they'll send you a copy. I've never had someone say no to me when I did that. You can check the sample sizes in that paper, check the total numbers of outcomes, see how that might match up to if you were to do something like this in your shelter, and so you can understand how the effect would be, and then look for other papers that say the same thing, and critically the opposite, other papers that say something completely different from this. And then finally, you just need to decide how much do you believe it, and what action should you take if you do or don't believe it. And then think about the risk and reward trade-offs that go with that belief. Okay, so a little more practical, let's talk about how to use research tools effectively. Scholar.google.com is almost the only thing you'll need. There are definitely situations where you might need to go outside that, but it has become extremely effective for research. And so if you're looking for papers, I highly recommend going there. We'll use it as the example. Let's say we want to learn about ringworm, so we want to know what can we do about ringworm, and we need somewhere to start. So one thing to keep in mind is that what we call a disease or a condition or a situation is not always what scientists call them, so we should figure out what the science names for some of these things that we're dealing with are. A great source for that is to go to Wikipedia, so I can just Google ringworm Wikipedia, and then I find that there's sort of this alternate sciencey name that they use to describe ringworm. So when I'm searching for papers, I shouldn't just search for ringworm, I should search for this as well. You can use both, but the science names for things are what you're going to probably find in the papers. So another good point is that we really want to find strong evidence quickly because we don't have a lot of time. So look for review papers. So review is another keyword that we're interested in. And then finally, you might be interested in some keywords around diagnosis, treatment, these other things that are specific for you. So we found out some of this information, and we go in and generate our query. So I'm going to use this word that I can't pronounce, treatment, review, dogs, and cats. Keep in mind, dogs and cats could have just been canine and feline, because sometimes they'll use that in papers. But if I do this search, I end up finding this result. So this was from scholar.google.com. Notice that on the left here, I've clicked since 2016, so you can say, give me only recent papers to a certain time. That's usually a good place to start. If you're not finding good stuff, go ahead and expand that time period. But like we said, we do prefer more research that's more recent. And notice I use that review keyword, so I'm looking for papers that actually review other papers, because then you're not just getting one piece of evidence, you're getting a piece of evidence for every paper they review, which is going to be stronger. And then notice the dogs and cats issue that I talked about. Okay, so we've got this result. How do we read it? Well, first note that these top two papers are written by the same researcher. That's usually a good sign. You found someone who does work in this space, and therefore their papers are probably going to be a little bit more well-written, as opposed to sometimes you'll find a paper that's a one-off from an author, and they probably never tried to continue that line of research, and then you maybe shouldn't believe it quite as much because they're not as much of an expert in that area. We can also look at the dates. Notice one of them is from 3 years ago, one of them's from 1 year ago. So you might think, oh, more recent, go for the one that's 1 year ago. But you can look at how many times they've been cited as well. And this top one is only 3 years old and has been cited a good amount, while this new one really hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention yet. So you might want to start with the one that's gotten a little more attention in the research community. So now you found this paper. This is maybe a piece of advice that people feel like is a dirty piece of advice, but do not read the whole paper. It will take you so long, and it will... you will not get, it's diminishing returns when you try to read a whole paper. Scientists do not read the whole paper. If you are a first-year grad student, you are told you have to, but beyond that, people find ways to cheat. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how to cheat your way through some of that here in a bit. Okay, so let's take a paper. Co-housing maybe is a question we have a question we have about our shelter. Can I co-house animals? Is it safe to co-house them? Is it better to co-house them? And I find this paper, Evaluating Pair versus Solitary Housing, Kennels, etc. When you're reading a paper, if you've never read an academic paper before, you're generally going to see these sections. The abstract we already talked about, but an intro, something about the materials and methods or the experiment, results section, a discussion, sometimes a conclusion, which is nice. It's kind of like the abstract, but it just sums it all up at the end, and then a references. I sort of list through here, and you can kind of see different sections have different amounts of opinion sort of baked into them. So the conclusion is going to be pretty highly opinionated. The discussion will have a good amount of opinion, but the things like the results, methods, those are going to have very little opinion. And so keep that in mind as you're reading, that these different sections are going to have, to varying degrees, the biases of the author shown into them. But stuff like the research, results and materials and methods generally won't. Okay, so this is that paper that I just mentioned. This is generally what you'll see when you download one of these. The abstract is over here. The intro is sort of that next section. Materials and methods is usually pretty long, along with the results. Those are sort of the bulk of the paper. And then there's some discussion, which is usually a bit longer than the intro. And then the references. There's no conclusion in this one. Okay, so I want to read this, and all I really want is to get to the point of the paper. I already know the context of this. Maybe I've read a couple other papers on co-housing. I don't feel like I need to get a huge intro to this area. I'm pretty familiar with it. So what should I read? Well, I should skim and focus on figures within the results. That's sort of the key bit and the one that's the least opinionated. And then I should look at those first and last paragraphs of the discussion. That's where they're going to kind of set up the finding and then summarize the finding. So if I only have a little bit of time and I already have the context behind the work, that's sort of the perspective I should take on it. Let's say, though, that you're new to this field, you've never read a paper on co-housing. You should not do that. You shouldn't assume that you know about it if you've never read a paper on it. And so when you're first jumping into a topic, you should really give a thorough read of the introduction. That's where they're going to talk about the history of studying co-housing or any of these other things that you might need to know to understand the context of the paper. And then after you finish that, go ahead and read those first and last paragraphs of the discussion to get the gist of what the paper is actually about. Another common reason you might be looking at a paper is you think that it's BS, you hate its finding, and you think that that finding is going to do something terrible to you or your organization. And so what should you do when you're in that situation? You should give a very thorough read of the materials and methods to look for issues. Did they use a very small sample size? Were there no control groups? Were they just testing something other than what the paper title makes it sound like they're testing. Sometimes that's the case. The titles can just be misleading. Give a really detailed read of the results to look for issues, and then give a really good read of the discussion where the authors are going to try to give their own context and opinion about the paper. And it may turn out, and it often is the case, that the authors don't believe sort of the title of the paper nearly as strongly as the title implies. They might have a much softer opinion on their own work than what you would get the impression of based on how other people are talking about the work. And then the flip side of this is true too. You're going to do exactly the same thing if you think the paper is perfect. And for the exact opposite reason, instead of you trying to disprove it, you're trying to prove it to yourself and make sure there's no issues with it. And so your style of reading a paper is going to be the same if you have a very strongly negative or positive opinion about it. You should dig into these sections this way. And then finally, okay, you've only got 5 minutes. You want to get the gist of this paper. This is how you should read it. Read the abstract, read the first paragraph of the intro, skim the figures, and then read the last paragraph of the discussion. That's your crash course in any paper. Even if you only do this and start reading papers, but you do 2 or 3 a day, you're going to find that you're very quickly getting a lot of the context and other things that makes it easier for you to continue to do this. I wouldn't recommend, if you've never read papers starting with this idea, you really should read the intros of things. You're going to get a whole lot of really cool information and useful background and history that is going to make it a lot easier to do this down the line. But I would say the vast majority of scientists I know, this is how they read papers. Unless the paper really matters to something specific that they care about, they're not doing any of those other things I just talked about. Okay, on to some of the practical bits of reading those results sections. So scientists you'll hear talk about this idea of significance. So significance in a paper is a true or false statement about whether or not we believe in the result of the paper. And so significance, I think a lot of people assume if something's significant, it's useful, or it's true, or something like that. There's a lot of misconceptions about what significance means. The thing that everyone in this room really should care about is significance is there, but the effect size is big. So what's an effect size? An effect size, I'm going to use an imaginary example here because I didn't want to call out any particular researchers on effect size issues, but imagine that we think we've come up with some life-extending care for cats that involves tickling them, and we want to know how long do we extend their lives by tickling them. So we have 200 critically ill cats, and over a 2-year period, we randomly pick some to tickle, and we ask the question, does tickling extend their lives? So we might get a result like this, where we have on the bottom how many days they lived after their tickling treatment, and then we have the 2 groups, the experimental and the control, where the orange is the experimental. Significance here is just asking the question, is the blue to the left of the orange? That's all. And so if the blue, if we are convinced via our statistical test that the blue is to the left of the orange, then we say it's significant. There's nothing else in that statement other than saying they are not overlapping, and that one is to the side of the other. So are they different distributions is how a scientist might say that. But what we really want to know is, and you'll find this number, 5% or 0.05 is sort of the scientific threshold people use. This is an arbitrary and completely unimportant number that we picked about 50 years ago, and it's probably wrong. So that's the threshold, though, that science uses to decide if something is significant or not. Is there a 5% chance or better that they're not overlapping, or that our answer is not due to chance? But it's just a yes or no question at that point. So what you care about, though, if you want to implement this tickling treatment, is how far apart are these 2 things? So how many more days of life do I get my cats whenever this thing is significant by tickling them? And so in this case, we're asking not just does it work, but how well does it work? Because it could just be that it increases their lifespan by 4 seconds, in which case, yeah, it was significant, but who cares? That's not really a huge benefit given the amount of time it takes to tickle all those cats. But in this case, we found that it was 3 days. You can decide, is 3 days enough? Is 3 days worth it to you, given whatever cost you were going to take on? So that's effect size. And we can simulate sort of what it would look like if we had different effect sizes. So you see these, as they get farther and farther apart, that's a bigger and bigger effect size. But if you looked up at the numbers up here, there's one that says t-test and has a little value there. There's only a small range where that value is not below 0.05, which is what a scientist would use to say, is this significant or not? And so that's that teeny section right as they cross each other would be where scientists say, nope, not significant. But all of this other range is where you would want to decide, is it worth it? Is it something that's actually a valuable treatment? So we call that effect size, and you should definitely keep an eye out for it in any papers that you actually want to use in a practical setting. Significance is just the start of the question you should be asking. And if you wanted to dig into these things, you could see that there are like some statistics in the paper about assumptions, this significance question, and then that effect size, which is sometimes called Cohen's d. You may see that keyword in a paper, and the bigger the number, the better. So that's sort of how you should treat those things. All this can be very confusing, though, and so as I said before, researchers love what they do, and they spend a lot of time trying to get these papers out. They would love to answer your questions. I've never sent an email to a researcher asking questions where they didn't enthusiastically reply and try to start a conversation about it. I would say think about researchers loving their research a lot like everyone in this room loves the animals that we treat. It's the amount of time and attention and care that they give into these things is enormous, and so they want other people to be interested in it. They want people to come and talk to them about that work, and they'll be very enthusiastic if you reach out to them. I know it probably seems like they're busy, or they may be very important people or something like that. No matter how tenured the professor, I've never had someone not reply when I sort of was actually interested in their work. So ask them for help. They will help you. Another subtle point in all of this is that significance requirement means that any time they find a non-significant result in a paper, they don't get to publish it. So the significance is the requirement to get published. And so what you often find is that there are tons of experiments being run where we never find out the experiments even happened because they couldn't publish it. And so what you end up with is a situation where we only get to see things that worked, we never get to see things that didn't work. And so just because you don't find papers on a particular topic out in the world doesn't mean that that thing is good or bad or anything like that. There could be dozens of times researchers have tried that particular thing and never gotten it to work, and there could be reasons why they never got it to work. So the absence of evidence, the absence of finding papers or things that you might want to use to make decisions shouldn't tell you that that thing is not true or not possible. It's just to tell you that people weren't able to publish the results on it. And then this final piece of advice is that really coming back to this idea of decision making, all of these papers, all these things that you're going to find as you're doing these searches on Google Scholar and in other places should really just be changing your confidence about different ideas that you have, changing your beliefs about different things in certain directions. So you have more confidence because you find more papers on something. You have less confidence when you find papers that say the opposite, but not less confidence when you don't find papers, because there are lots of times when we don't publish papers simply because no one got funding for it, or one of the many other biases you saw earlier. And then really critically, this idea of being right or wrong in science is just a complete red herring. There's no such thing as being right. There's no such thing as being wrong. There's just having more evidence for something and using your belief as best you can to make the decisions you can in the moment. And with all that being said, at the end of the day, you're going to find plenty of situations where you don't find any papers on a topic that you care about. No one's published on it, or the papers aren't really clear, or you don't know how to use them. In which case, you should bias towards trying the thing you're interested in. And if you want to talk about how to do that in a way that you can then collect evidence to convince other people, come talk to me. That's basically you saying, I want to do research. Because anytime you're trying to convince someone else using some data and some evidence, you are a researcher. And so I think many people in this conference are researchers, whether we realize it or not. If you want to be more convincing, then you adopt more of these scientific practices. And it depends on who you're trying to convince as well. But bias towards actually trying it, because the idea that just because I can't find a researcher who's done it, or just because I can't find proof, which doesn't really exist, but evidence for something, doesn't mean that that thing doesn't work, and it doesn't mean that it's not a possibility. So those are the 10 pieces of advice. I won't go through them again, but if you'd like to talk about any of those specific pieces, I would love to talk about them more. And I'll leave you with a quote that I think really sums up some of these feelings about how you should interact with research and how you should bias towards trying in your activities with research, which is Arthur C. Clarke was a science fiction writer, and in the 60s, he wrote 3 laws. One you're probably very familiar with is or you might be familiar with if you watch science fiction, is any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's his 3rd law. This one's a little less well known, but I think is very poignant to the topic of science, which is when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he's almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. So, thank you.